let's jump back into part two.
Tim, do you want to take us through the cap operations?
Yes, sure. So the Royal Navy's fighter aircraft in the Falklands War was the Sea Harrier, and it was designated FRS-1, and that stood for Fighter Reconnaissance Strike. In the 90s, we got a much improved version as a result of the Falklands War called the FA-2. So the Sea Harrier entered service in 1980 with the Royal Navy after we got rid of our big fleet aircraft carriers like the Ark Royal with the F4 Phantom. The Sea Harrier was powered by the Rolls-Royce Pegasus engine, and it was a development from the GR3 ground attack Harrier. But the cockpit was raised up with a bubble-type canopy to give it much better view out of the cockpit. And I would actually say, would you think, Hop, that out of all the fast jet types down in the Falklands, the Sea Harrier probably had the best visibility all round from the cockpit with that bubble canopy, and that may have contributed to its success. I'm throwing a question to you there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you didn't have any rails. The bubble canopy sitting high, mid-wing design, you could really see forward and to basically low on your sixes, your 3 and your 9 o'clock. So it had superior canopy configuration than the Daggers or the Skyhawks or the Mirage 3s. The Pucara had pretty good viz, but it wasn't in the air-to-air role at all. So absolutely, and it made a difference, especially for the 800 guys, because they seem to rely more on visual search than the 801 guys.
Yeah, that's just something I thought of when I was putting together the research. I've never heard mentioned anywhere. The visibility from the cockpit. The nose was extended to put the Blue Fox radar in the Sea Harrier, which was an air-to-air radar principally, but could also be used in the air-to-surface role. Armament could carry the Sidewinder missile. The particular version that the Harrier deployed in the Falklands was the Sidewinder AIM-9 Lima, and lots been made about the significance of that and the capability of the missile. So a little bit of background to it. Prior to the war, the Sea Harrier was equipped with the AIM-9 Golf missile, and Sharkey Ward instructed the staff of the 3rd Flotilla, to which HMS Invincible was attached, to get hold of the new 9 Lima variant from the US. The task force actually sailed with 19 AIM-9 Limas, and there were NATO stocks of them available at RAF Lucas in Scotland, and the UK ordered 100 extra 9 Limas from the US. Jeremy Black, captain of HMS Invincible, said that over the weekend after the invasion, when they were frantically storing ship, there are actually some arrived from Germany. So a little bit more about the missile then. The guidance is by an infrared seeker that repeatedly sights the target and determines the change in position since the last sighting. So its guidance system maintains a constant angle between the missile and the target to achieve an interception. This is called proportional pursuit. It's very accurate and straightforward. The AIM-9 Golf was the first variant of Sidewinder that allowed the missile's seeker head to be slaved to an aircraft's radar. The scanning speed of the 9 Lima was greatly increased over the 9 Golf from 70 to 125 hertz, and the seeker head's view was now a 25-degree circular scan. It had much improved target acquisition over earlier models. The 9 Golf achieved a 46% hit rate during Operation Linebacker 1 and 2 in Vietnam in 1972, scoring 21 kills. The AIM-9 Lima entered production in 1977 and was described as an all-aspect missile with a new seeker head, double canards, and which gave it very high manoeuvrability. Dimensions: it's 2.9 meters long, wingspan about 2 feet, and weight around 85 kilos. The warhead is 11 kilograms continuous rod passive IR fuse. As I mentioned before, the reticle speed is 125 hertz, and the missile will accelerate to Mach 1.8 above the launch aircraft speed. In the front aspect, it was more vulnerable to flares, but I've never read any account of Argentinian aircraft deploying flares during the Falklands War. In fact, all the accounts of the engagements with AIM-9 Lima during the Falklands were actually in the stern aspect. The improved seeker head in the AIM-9 Lima used a compressed gas to cool the seeker head, and this gas was liquid nitrogen. The detector material in the seeker head is lead sulfide. Cooling it increases its sensitivity overall, but peak sensitivity changes wavelengths, leading to the seeker better finding the exhaust plume of the aircraft. Also, in my opinion, it's possible that the cold conditions, the grey skies, lack of sun, might have improved Sidewider's performance in the Falklands War over that achieved during Vietnam. A little aside on the 9 Lima, its larger canards meant it didn't fit perfectly the Sea Harrier's launcher assembly unit. This was a bit of an early stumbling block in the first test firings that took place in the ranges off the coast of Wales as the Falkland Islands made it south. And the simple solution was that they just shaved a bit off of the launcher assembly unit to make it fit. The 30mm Aden cannon with 120 rounds per gun could also drop iron bombs, and post the Falklands War it was able to carry the Sea Eagle anti-ship missile, which was a very potent air-to-surface anti-ship missile. Possibly could carry 2-inch rockets. Sharkey Ward mentions that. The initial organisation of the two squadrons was that 801 in Invincible would concentrate on air defence, and 800 in Hermes would lean towards air-to-ground work. And that was very much at Sharkey Ward's own instigation, because his squadron was a lot more au fait with the radar in the Sea Harrier, the Blue Fox radar. By the time we get to the amphibious landings, the two squadrons, 800 in Hermes, 801 Invincible, had both been augmented by the third squadron that was formed, 809 Squadron, which was formed in response to the Falklands crisis. 801 Squadron kept 2 jets at Alert 5 day and night for pretty much the whole of the conflict, from when they got down to the total exclusion zone. And that was very draining for the crews to have 2 jets 24 hours a day on Alert 5, people sat in the cockpits. When it came to the defence of the amphibious operations area, Admiral Woodward insisted on a 10-mile by 10-mile box around the amphibious air operating area up to 10,000 feet, which Sea Harriers were not to enter. He was concerned about blue-on-blue engagements, and this actually led to a very heated argument between him and one of his staff officers, to which Woodward said, "I don't care about your bloody rules. This is the way that we're going to do it." Now, the Sea Harrier may have been new to Royal Navy and Fleet Air Arms service, but the pilots certainly were not. So people like Sharkey Ward, who commanded 801 Squadron, and Andy Auld, who commanded 800 Squadron, had both flown F4 Phantoms from the conventional carrier Ark Royal. Others had flown Buccaneers, Gannets, and there were a number of RAF pilots who were on exchange with the Navy, who'd flown GR3s, and some of them even flown Lightnings. How the aircraft were employed caused a lot of friction amongst the task force, in particular between Sharkey Ward and the Admiral's staff. And in his book, Sea Harrier Over the Falklands, and in the oral histories that he gave to the Imperial War Museum that are all available on the Imperial War Museum website, he talks about the Admiral's staff directing the cap to swoop down on the enemy from above like hawks, after they'd made their attacks, which obviously Ward found this incredulous, that why would you wait until the enemies made their attack before trying to intercept them?
Well, it makes
So-
no sense. You want to engage someone at the first opportunity as opposed to the last opportunity.
Exactly. Totally. So Sharkey Ward in 801 thought this was complete nonsense. So Sharkey Ward's assessment of the Argentine Air Force on the way south was that, in his words, they'd be good pole handlers. By that, he means that they will fly the aircraft well. He expected them to be brave, but he didn't think they would be so good at fighting their aircraft due to lack of combat experience and training. They'd also be operating in an alien environment overseas, away from the mainland, which they wouldn't have done before. And he actually believes that the Argentine High Command had a greater respect for the Sea Harrier than his own High Command. He expected a kill ratio of 10-1, so that's 10 Argentine jets killed, shot down for every one Sea Harrier. On the way south, in conjunction with Commander-in-Chief Fleet and Captain Jeremy Black of Invincible, Sharkey will put out lots of propaganda, backed up with some results from exercises in the media. He had the highest respect for the courage and bravery shown by the Argentine aircraft pilots, but he expected the Sea Harrier force to do well. In exercises before the war, the Sea Harrier had achieved a 25-1 kill ratio on exercises over F4 Phantoms, 40-1 over the F-14, which, although it was very manoeuvrable, had quite a slow roll rate, and even against the new F-15s, overall in air combat manoeuvring, they were achieving a 3-1 kill ratio. So Ward had every confidence in the aircraft and in his pilots that they'd do well. And he instructed his pilots to fly at a maximum height of 250 feet and at endurance speed. But he did remind them not to go into the box. Now, what's interesting about endurance speed is obviously that's much slower than fighting airspeed. And his pilots questioned him on that, but he pointed out two things. He said, one, you're better than they are, so I'm backing you that even if you're not at fighting airspeed, you can still beat them. The other thing is the Harrier had a tremendous thruster weight ratio, and when you think about it, it's got to have a thruster weight ratio of pretty close to 1 because it's got to be able to hover. So it had a really good ability to accelerate from low speed to high speed, and about the only thing about that time that could actually match it for acceleration from low to high speed was the Phantom. When it came to the defence of the amphibious area, Commodore Clapp, who was the Commodore Amphibious Warfare, he wanted to have 3 cap stations filled all the time with 2 aircraft on each cap station. Admiral Woodward said, no, you can have 1 cap station with 2 aircraft, and if we get intelligence that a raid's launched, we'll surge that to a second pair. So, despite the fact that I think really the amphibious assault was pivotal to the whole operation, that you couldn't recapture the islands unless you got your troops ashore, the Admiral doesn't seem to have been willing to give the amphibious commander the air defence that he wanted. Initially, Antrim, as we mentioned earlier, was the anti-air warfare commander and responsible for directing capping the amphibious area, and she was the only dedicated anti-air warfare ship in the Sound. But she was only there for 1 day after she took damage on the 21st of May. Admiral Woodward's staff also signalled bizarrely that the Sea Harriers should operate with their radars off, and this was another order from the Admiral's staff that 801 Squadron ignored, and they kept their radars on. They, on 801, had a lot of confidence in the radar. Sharkey Ward had been responsible for bringing the Sea Harrier into Royal Navy service. So when the aircraft first arrived, he commanded the intensive flying unit that did all the trials for the Sea Harrier. Then he commanded the operational conversion unit, which was 899 Squadron, and then he commanded 801 Squadron. And 801 had achieved detection ranges using the Blue Fox radar Sea Harrier versus Sea Harrier of over 20 miles out, in some cases as far as 23 miles, which is pretty good, wouldn't you agree, Hop?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this was sort of an old style radar, and just an interesting aside, the 23-mile ranges that they were getting, they figured out that there was that they had the engineers had sprayed a bunch of WD-40 on some of the birds, the Harriers, to for anti-corrosion purposes as they were coming across on the Atlantic conveyor and some of these other places. And for something about the WD-40 added several miles to the detection range and caused the radar cross section to expand greatly or be enhanced. Radar cross section is the amount of metal, for lack of a better term, that reflects radar waves back to the transmitter so it can receive them, and that's what makes a aircraft more easily seen. And something about they had to figure out how to get the WD-40 off the bloody things because they had a higher radar cross section than the ones that hadn't had WD-40 on them. But that's an extremely good detection range, and was right at the outer limits of what the brochure said it would do, which is usually not what the operational limit is.
So here's a question, right? And for the man on the ground, so what's the point in saying you want those radars off, right? Radars are on a plane for a reason. What possible reason would it be for them to be wanting to, turn them off?
Tim, you want to take this? Because I can't possibly think of a reason why you wouldn't want them on.
Yeah, I mean, Sharkey Ward. I mean, he says in his book, doesn't he, and in the oral history on the Imperial War Museum, that he thought Admiral Woodward was incompetent. The other issue with it was 800 Squadron in Hermes weren't as worked up on the aircraft, and he said that they were only getting Sea Harrier to Sea Harrier detection ranges of about 8 miles maximum, which he was stunned with and said, look, hey, do you want me to send my engineers over to 800 and we'll help you get the radars tuned up and such like? And 800 said no. And so it was Sharkey Ward's opinion that initially what happened apparently was the Admiral said, I don't want you turning your radars on until you're within 10 miles of the bad guys. And then later on he said, I don't want you using your radars at all. And whether this was some sort of paranoia that he was worried about, it would
I could see coming off the carrier with your radars off in case you've got somebody messing around with RWR and they're going to try and ascertain what the carriers are.
Which I think they did because they flew low level for 50 miles away from the carriers and then climbed up to cruise altitude for the transit to the islands.
Right.
But what Sharkey Ward says is Admiral Woodward had no understanding of air warfare and no interest in learning how to understand it, and he wasn't prepared. He wasn't prepared to listen to his subject matter experts, his experts in warfare, different fields of warfare. Admiral Woodward was a submariner. He didn't understand air warfare, and he wasn't prepared, or for whatever reason, to try and understand it. And Sharkey Ward talks about all the papers and signals that 801 Squadron produced on the way south about how to employ the Sea Harrier, about how good the radar was, how to use the radar, how to counter the Etendard Exocet threat. And he doesn't even think the Admiral ever read any of it. But Sharkey Ward was...
To be fair, he was the product of the 1970s, wasn't he? So he was used to having Ark Royal and Eagle, and he was used to having Gannet airborne early warning aircraft. Yeah. So he was facing a fundamental difference in UK carrier ops, which up until 4 years ago, when Ark Royal went, Ark Royal would have been there and she'd have put Gannets up, and they'd have had overhead airborne early warning. And as you say, he wasn't an AEW guy. He wasn't a fast jet pilot. Northwood was sending lots of contradictory information about Argentine capabilities, and how they would employ strike packages. And the one thing that I think it's easy to say that he didn't really appreciate the air threat. If you remember when we did the Sheffield episode, CTG, Sandy Woodward, had said there is an air threat here. This is our primary air threat. There was such a breakdown between CTG and various ships that Sheffield command went, no, it's not. It's anti-submarine, and that's partly why we see Sheffield getting hit, because command on Sheffield went, no, that's rubbish. The big threat is ASW. And then when you look at the way that 801 Squadron were employed, I mean, the horror stories that Sharkey Ward talks about is hops. So the same squadron, 801, were getting pulled for night alert every single night. And the excuses that would be used were the Harriers on Hermes would be they needed to be rested because they were planning a raid on Stanley or something like that. So Sharkey Ward, as a squadron commander, he's getting called up by Jeremy Black, and Jeremy Black's on the bridge and he's saying, Sharkey, you've got night alert. Now, night alert is going to be what, 2 pilots plus 2 kind of knocking around in flight suits in the briefing room.
So you're going to have 2 guys in the cockpit, basically, need to be, the standard is airborne in 5 minutes, but if you're at 4 minutes 59 seconds when you finally lift off the ramp, you've probably screwed up. I mean, it's a lot tighter than that. Plus, all the people around it that need to take the chains off and remove the chocks and do this, that, and the other. Then you got 2 guys fully kitted up down in the ward room or the ready room, sitting there listening to the AAWC and everything else that's going on, and they're going to be going up next and sitting in the cockpit for 90 minutes, and everybody's got to be preserving their night vision and all this other stuff, and your sleep schedule is totally hosed, and that doesn't mean you're not going to fly 3 hops the next day either. Everybody has to suffer equally.
And what does he say in his book? He says it got to the point where he had to go and see Jeremy Black on the bridge and say, I can't do this. We can't keep this tempo. I'm pulling them out of the cockpits. I mean, I'll just keep them at least somewhere where they can get a few hours kept, because if we start doing this, if we continue with it, we're going to start having air accidents. And for a squadron commander to directly contravene CTG and have the moral courage to say, nah, not happening. No, there's something wrong.
That's the really important thing is that you've got a squadron commander who has the moral background, the moral fiber to go, can't do it. Right? That's within the military. That's absolutely crucial.
And he was Mr. Harrier. I mean, this guy was. Yeah. He'd overseen the introduction of FRS-1 into the fleet. This was a guy who publicly flew a Harrier into BBC studios, didn't he? And landed at Pebble Mill at 1. He was the acknowledged air warfare expert. But if you look at if you read his book, he had his air warfare guys, and he wouldn't say, right, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do this. He would go to his air warfare officers and he'd say, I need this done. You come up with a fucking plan. You get back to me, then I will present it to Air Group Commander, and then we'll go to the skipper, and we'll do it that way.
That's the definition of leadership, isn't it?
Yeah. Whereas Sandy Woodward was kind of, I don't think he was even trying to micromanage. I think he just delegated it down to probably someone who wasn't Harrier qualified, and no one in Hermes's Harrier group had the kind of kahunas to walk up there and say, Admiral.
Well, it's worse than that, in my opinion. During the transit down to the Falklands, 801 took everybody they had, and they had a couple of GR3 guys that they yanked out of a bar on a Friday morning or Friday night, and they were in a Sea Harrier cockpit by Sunday afternoon. They got all those guys night deck qualified, which is no small thing. And you start with pinky landings, which are landings that are right around official sunset, but there's, as we all know, there's still about 30 minutes of light. Okay, so that's what 801 was doing. 800 had 2 semi-qualified pilots for Pinky landings, and made very little progress, if any. It's kind of hard to ascertain as they progressed from Portsmouth down to Ascension and training these guys to get them night deck qualified. So, and also 800 was scheduled to have an ORE probably, I think, 30 or 60 days, past when they actually deployed. And I think they would have had a really hard, an ORE for people listening is an operational readiness exercise. It's to prove that your squadron or unit is fully up to speed and combat capable. And it's a big test, and it lasts like a week. Well, they never had their ORE, and they probably would have been, according to Sharkey, very exposed if they had to go through an actual ORE. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, and Sharkey Ward had taken his jets up against the fight wing at Lakenheath and against early marks of F-15 and shown that not only could they hold their own, but in certain situations, this was a fantastic jet. If you look at the lack of integration between Commander Amphibious Warfare and people like Sharkey Ward, and even merchant ship skippers were not being called into briefings when they were discussing the air defense of the anchorage and protecting the landing area. So, I mean, for me and Tim, it's normal. What you would have is the FEZ, the fighter engagement zone. You have the MEZ, missile engagement zone, and then you have the crossover zone. And the crossover zone is kind of where the cap controller. So Tim would, he's got 2 jets chasing 4 jets, and he's going to decide where, all right, they're not going to get rounds off. They need to turn back, and then the ships are going to take over the engagement. Now, if we're talking about Seacat and Seawolf and 4.5-inch gun, the missile engagement zone is going to be really tight. It's only going to be maybe 6 miles, I think. The 4.5 gun is not going to be firing at maximum range. So really, the Harriers should have been given the option to chase down targets right up to, I reckon, about 6 miles under positive cap control by Antrim. And it just wasn't happening, was it, Tim?
No, and going back to that moral fortitude, Sharkey Ward talks about when they were doing the trials for the Sea Harrier, and you mentioned it there against the F-15s, they were doing lots of air combat, close air combat, and the reason for that was it gets you fully au fait with the handling of the jet, how you can maneuver it, what its limits are. And he got this signal from I can't remember who it was, someone up the chain of command saying you're doing too much of this air combat manoeuvring. You need to be doing other things. And Sharkey Ward was like, well, I'm Mr. Sea Harrier. We either do it my way, or if you don't like what I'm doing, you find someone else to take it over and I'll resign. And he was left to get on with it. He also talks about that line in the Admiral's book where Admiral Woodward says, I'm an admiral because I'm intellectually superior to everybody else. I think that's just a ridiculous sort of arrogance, really, and I think that's why he wouldn't listen to. He just came up with his own way of doing things about which he didn't know anything and wasn't prepared to listen to people.
Of course, the Royal Navy is littered through that for the 400, 500 years of admirals ignoring people, right, and then ending up on the Needles and sinking ships, etc. By the way, I appreciate I'm an army guy, so it's not a deliberate dissent, but there are a numerous examples through history of admirals who've just ignored common sense because they believed that they are correct for whatever reason.
Don't get me started on Admiral King in World War II. I mean, this is not a Royal Navy only problem.
Can we talk about Admiral King?
Yeah, but we won't. But I mean, this is something that is endemic to flag rank in some cases. Just saying.
Yeah, and Sharkey Ward, he gives a number of examples of the flag not knowing how to employ the Sea Harrier, and we talked about one of them in the Sheffield podcast, didn't we? Where Sharkey Ward's on cap out to the west, and Hermes, who wasn't even controlling the cap, they were under the control of one of the destroyers. said Vector 090, 85 miles for trade. And Sharky Ward just goes negative. And they come back and said, from the Admiral, you are to Vector 090, 85 for trade. Get on with it. And Sharky Ward just says, well, they can't possibly be hostiles 85 miles to the east of me. Check who's just taken off from your own deck. And then Hermes come back and says, oh, sorry, that's our red section. And Sharky Ward says, well, Hermes and Invincible were in close company, and Invincible's got Sea Dart. So if you've got hostiles 15 miles away, why isn't Invincible being told to engage them? Why are you sending a fighter 85 miles in the wrong direction?
And it's it's inexcusable, isn't it? Because even though you can say, well, Hermes was a manual ship, so she didn't have a combat system. So the Type 42s, they would have been sharing the radar picture on link 10. But I'm sorry, prior to tactical data link being a thing, the carriers still knew where they were launching and recovering aircraft from, and it smacks of that. There was something seriously wrong with the two carriers.
Oh, and don't forget, Dom, that the AAWC was literally on Intrepid. They were in charge. How is anybody getting vectors from Hermes if the AAWC is...
So in San Carlos, the AWC, the anti-air warfare coordinator, was Antrim. Normally, the anti-air warfare coordinator would be on Invincible. Invincible were 50% responsible for the loss of Sheffield because everything had gone right on the day. Take Sheffield out of the equation and just take Glasgow and Invincible. Everything kind of worked, despite the fact that they took the combat air patrol off task and sent them to do a surface search. But the thing is, after that, for there not to have been a kind of sit down amongst the command team on Invincible and Hermes, and a soul search on what went wrong, why have we just lost to 42? And then again for whoever was on Hermes, so I assume it was her, if Invincible had AWC, Tim, how did Hermes try and bring the cap round to intercept their own two aircraft? Because just Invincible would have been AWC. So how did she relinquish duties, or did Hermes just decide, right, I'm now going to be AWC?
I think Hermes and the flag just butted in because Sharky said he was under the control of one of the destroyers. It's just totally against the way you do things, that the up threat radar pickets are given the duty of controlling the cap, and you let them get on with it. And Sharky Ward says on the 4th of May, when Sheffield was lost, that Hermes was launching Sea Harriers to do local surface searches without informing anyone. And that caused a lot of confusion and false alarms with ships picking up the Sea Harriers radar. And it could easily be misidentified as a Super Étendard. But you got all this confusion generated because Invincible's the AWC. Yeah, she's controlling all the air movements, and Hermes is going off launching aircraft without seeking her permission or telling them where they're going or what they're doing.
If Hot was a P3 commander and you'd be under positive control, if you were under control of the task group, you'd be under positive control of the ASUW coordinator. It's kind of like another ship jumping in and going and calling your call sign and say, right, I need you to do a box search up here. And you'd be, who are you? Wouldn't you?
Yeah.
You're not the ASUW.
Oh, absolutely. And that would happen. You'd be operating with a carrier battle group and I don't know, some ASU guy would call you up and say, oh, we've got contact, over here, and inevitably you go, well, where's the carrier? And it'd be after the carrier, and it would either be a plane guard helo or they were doing the marshaling stack, and it was a recovery time, and some junior guy in a destroyer 40 miles away would kick into the door of the Alpha Whiskey frequency and start trying to give people vectors, which is a quick way to get people killed. So yeah, that we would do that too, but then there would be a major dressing down on freak of whoever popped up, and get back in your box and shut up. basically. But apparently that didn't happen. You know, there was such a big tug of war between Hermes and Invincible, which is unimaginable because this is actual combat.
Yeah. And the third example he talks about was that one morning 801 got tasked to do a dawn low-level strike against some helicopters that were on Mount Kent, I think it was. They actually received the signal after the time on target that the signal specified. The flag hadn't sent the signal until after the time they'd specified the raid was to take place. And in this signal, it said there's some radar laid AAA that is in the area, but it didn't tell them where it was. And Sharkey Ward said they would have known where it was because Special Forces had located them, but the signal just said, watch out for this AAA. And this big argument went on where Sharkey Ward said, I'm not doing it until you tell me where these AAA sites were. And the signal also said you to do it at low level with 1,000-pound iron bombs. And Sharkey Ward said, well, that's the wrong weapon. You can't go in low level with 1,000-pound iron bombs because of the shrapnel. We'll bomb ourselves down. This needs to be done with 2-inch rockets and cannon. And the signal specified, we want you to ingress via here and egress via there. And Ward just said, no, I'm not doing it. So the way it's done is that you tell us what you want us to target, when you want us to hit, and where the threats are, and we do the rest. He said in the end, they did the sortie, but did it from medium level. But by the time they got round to doing it, the helicopters probably weren't there anyway. And he also talked about that he knew that Hermes and the flag were getting all manner of intelligence that he really needs to know, but they then just never got sent any of it in Invincible. It was all held in Hermes and not disseminated.
That's the sort of thing you might see with micromanagers who want to micromanage certain areas. It shouldn't be to do with egos. It's supposed to be keeping people alive, as opposed to saying, go and do it that way. I mean, I've heard that many a time, right? And officers say, do that. And you go, but you can't do it like that.
Yeah, it's that whole, the mission command concept. I give you the mission and then you take command and go do it, which is sort of one of the basic underpinnings of theoretically Western military ethos. I mean, and it doesn't matter if it's the Army, the Navy, or, surface Navy, the air contingent of the Navy, but that just seems to have gone out the window. And it was a problem that the Americans experienced in tremendous amount in Vietnam with the route packages that were getting approved by, Johnson. And there finally was an Air National Guard group and linebacker too that said, no, we're not doing it that way. Well, just tell us, give us our time on target. Tell us when we're going to be there. Tell us who else is going to be there. But we're not going to fly the same track, that we flew yesterday and the day before that, and get swapped out of the sky by SA-2s. And guys like, professionals like Ward and J.J. Buck, they know all these things. It's interesting though, and I think it was sort of the softening of old age that later in his life, Ward sort of let Woodward off the hook and said he thinks that Woodward's staff just wasn't giving him the information. I don't know if I believe that.
I think I can recall a couple of instances where suggested op plans were being booted up the chain and then they just weren't making it to him. Your argument for that is, well, that's down to him. Still, if you break it down to like basic, so if I'm a sergeant, if I'm a platoon sergeant and things are going wrong in the platoon and my corporals aren't telling me that there are big issues going on, that's my issue. I've failed there because I'm not running a crew where my full screws feel empowered enough to come to me and say, this is going wrong, that's going wrong. And I think absolutely you should scale that up. If you're CTG, day one, lesson one, I need SMEs to tell me what's going on and to give me good advice. I can't know everything as CTG.
As I was saying though, Gunny, this is indicative of someone who doesn't like people telling him stuff. They're frightened to suggest or whatever because guess what? The person's I'm in charge. That's a constant, right? It's indicative of all that type of behaviour.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
well, a good leader will listen to his staff, and that can be at the micromanagement kind of level. That can be a platoon sergeant listening to his full screws and his land shacks, or it can be CTG of a battle group. You know, you could take another instance of it when they were planning for San Carlos and planning the landings. That all sorts of excuses were coming in for the RFA captains and the ships taken up from trade captains were not part of the command briefings. And the excuses were, well, you know, it's really difficult getting them on board the ship. These are captains of civilian vessels who absolutely need to be part of that command briefing, because apart from a few general purpose machine guns, they're looking at the grey things to stop them getting killed. So purely from a morale and a conformity of command style, you want everyone in. If you can't do that, then you send a representative across to that ship and you say to the master of the Elk, look, here's the plan. Here's what's going to happen. This is going to be the order of entry into the harbour. These are the assets that we're going to put in where. This is how the combat air patrol is going to work. We are going to do our utmost, absolute utmost, to protect you, but this is going to be a tough gig. And it just seems across the board there wasn't that continuity of command. It was like there was Hermes and the command bubble, and then they managed to carry it off, but it was purely luck. Now, if you transfer that across to 1991, we had a different problem in that there were so many signals. We were clearing signals 1,000 a day, and we were just clearing them off a system called DIMPs. But for the Northern Group, the two US battleships, the Type 42 destroyers, Princeton and Samuel, I think it's Samuel Roberts, there was clear cooperation between the bombardment group commander and commander mine warfare countermeasures, and Tripoli that was coordinating everything, and it kind of ran fairly smoothly. And certainly the coordination with the CAP, Combat Air Patrol, and the E3 Sentry that was usually overhead or operating to one degree or another, way better. Now, that's great in 1991. Was there an excuse for that not being in place in 1982? Fucking no. Absolutely not, because we've been in the anti-air warfare game for a very long time, the Royal Navy. Absolutely no excuse for it.
But it'd been a long time since the Royal Navy had actually seen proper contact.
Yeah, but the thing is, David, we pioneered the Action Information Organisation. You know, we were doing this in its embryonic state in 1943, 1944. None of this was new. None of this was, you know, we alongside the US Navy, we were pioneering airborne early warning aircraft. First airborne early warning aircraft went up in 1945 in the Pacific. So, you know, we were top of the game for it. And up until 1978, we were operating Gunny airborne early warning aircraft from the old HMS Art Royal. But what you just see is, as Tim and Hopper pointed out, a failure to be human and just to say, I need my SMEs around me, my two squadron commanders, Harriers. What can you do for me? I'm the battle group commander. I've got fucking lots to worry about. Air threat. What can you do? What do you need from my ships? What do you need from the anti-air warfare coordinator? How do I facilitate you killing stuff before my ships even have to start shooting? How do we sort out potential blue on blue? What capabilities can you offer? Can you do surface sweeps? Because I'm worried about surface groups. Yeah, boss, I can do that using radar. Okay, brilliant. So I don't have to take you off a combat air patrol station. No, we can do it from here. We can do a good sweep. Instead, what you have is, I need you to go and visually search for warship. Well, and shocking what's going on. I can fucking do that with radar. Go and do a surface search. Huh, fine. Okay. And that, you know, that lost us a 42.
Right, okay. So let's crack on here, though. So we've got the training for amphibious operations.
So very quickly, so you got post 1952. the UK military essentially passed amphibious ops to the Royal Marines. There was a lot of inter-service rivalry. Everyone's vying for low budgets. RAF and the Royal Navy particularly were scrapping for air priority. The RAF, as they do and as they still do, were arguing that carriers were obsolete. That's probably a podcast within itself. And that's why you see a reduction in Royal Navy carrier strength over the decades. Now, within the MOD, amphibiosity, right, the conduction of amphibious operations was seen as a necessary part of British policy and needed to embrace all arms. Right? There was that recognised idea that maritime strategy was going to always include amphibious operations. That's kind of cemented in 1961 Q8. Yeah, we were in the Persian Gulf in 1961, folks. Operation Vantage, a short notice ops, and that really proved that amphibious operations at short notice were absolutely essential if we were going to continue to influence worldwide affairs. Interestingly, one of the lessons from 1961 Q8 was how difficult it was going to be to establish ground-based air defense if you were going to do amphibious ops, right? Just pay that in for a minute. So at the wash-up of Op Vantage, the MOD went, we need to get better if we're going to do amphibious landings at ground-based air defense to cover those ops. The other thing that came up, as Ricky alluded to earlier, was the storing of ships. Because it was a short notice operation, 1961, there were some real issues with storing with ships. Kit was not loaded as it was required, i.e. most important stuff goes on last because it's first off. But the biggest, or one of the biggest lessons, and one of the things the MOD kind of wrote up in the paper was, we need a mobile air search radar. Right, 1961. So after that, amphibious ops, they kind of play second fiddle to anti-submarine warfare. The Royal Navy was moving, although we still had strike carriers, the Russian submarine threat was going to be the killer because there was a thing called reforger in place. The idea was when the Russians moved west into Germany, yes, the kit would be there. There would need to be more kit. There would need to be people. Escorting convoys was going to be one part of it, and taking the fight to the Russians in the Norwegian Sea. Plus, the UK still has the idea that we need to be able to influence things east of Suez. The big problem with it was whilst we went, yeah, we need Royal Marines. Royal Marines are going to be really useful. Also, Navy budget had to be switched over to moving the army about the place. So you got the LSLs, so Tristram, Percival, Galahad, etc. And essentially they're there to assist in moving British Army equipment across. But it came out of the Royal Navy budget. Fantastic. So the Royal Navy's already fighting for money. And then the Army's saying, well, you need to build these ships and we need to use your vessels for moving our kit around. Thanks, British Army. Fast forward, 1981. All right, HMS Art Royal, our last fixed-wing strike carrier, has gone. HMS Eagle, she'd gone a few years before. She was in a better state than HMS Art Royal. Allegedly, the Queen intervened because Art Royal is a massive name in the Royal Navy and said, well, I would rather you kept Art Royal going than HMS Eagle. HMS Eagle being better materially, yet she needed a refit, but there were kind of ideas that she'd be kept going to 1984, 1985. White paper, Royal Marines, why do we need them? And this was placed before John Knott.
That's an astonishing question, isn't it? The Royal Marines, why do you need them?
Why do we need HMS Fearless and HMS Intrepid? It was absolutely in contravention of Labour's 1978 defence plan. Right? You always hear that Labour were going to gut the forces. Retention of Intrepid and Fearless were part of Labour's projected defence plan. They also wanted to bring back HMS Bulwark, that was an ex-light strike carrier that had a big fire. She was materially, she was a mess, but Labour wanted to bring her back into full service as a Royal Marine commando carrier. So basically, we're trying to be strong everywhere. we're trying to play to our maritime strengths, but you get John Knott in, who sits down and he has some conversations with experts in inverted commas, and it gets to the point where he questions whether the Royal Navy needs surface ships, full stop. And then when shown pictures of HMS Intrepid and Fearless, he says, "What are these for?" So a civilian dropped into Defence Secretary, very skeptical about the surface fleet, who listens to people who spin him tales of, well, the future's in submarines. You don't need destroyers. You definitely don't need aircraft carriers. And you certainly don't need Royal Marines at all. So by 1981, Royal Marines and any sea lift capability are in the gun sight. He's just not seeing the point of them whatsoever. Obviously, Lord Lewin, he's involved in consultations and he's kind of jumping up and down and screaming and going, really? An additional problem is the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff, a guy called Lieutenant General Sir Maurice Johnston. He kind of saw the reinforcement of Norway, which wasn't David. That was one of our prime things. In the event of the Cold War going hot, Royal Marines were going to go into Norway and they were going to defend the northern flank. And he's like, nah.
I didn't know that in Norway. Yeah.
Yeah. He went, nah, it's not going to work. The thing will be over by the time you get there. Therefore, what do we need the Royal Marines for? These landing ship platform docks are expensive. They're vulnerable. What we should do is, if we're going to reinforce somewhere, do it by air. Well, of course, because he's in the British fucking army. So, of course, he's going to go, Royal Marines, what do you need them for? I could do it better with airborne. Because doing an airborne drop into Norway in the face of a Russian push on the northern flank is going to be entirely practical. I mean, who wouldn't want to be in the back of a Hercules with flankers and fencers?
Everyone who's on the plane wouldn't want to be in it doing that. Yeah.
But the bizarre thing is, John Knott, with no real military experience, goes, oh, God, yeah. And it's another case of a civilian listening to people and having no background kind of knowledge to answer difficult questions.
And quite possibly with his own agenda, because we've got to remember that just after the Falklands, the defence spending went off a cliff.
Yeah. He was a bean counter. He saw cuts to RN as being a way to save money, to invest in UK air defence, not to go to British Army of the Rhine, but primarily to go to things like UK air defence, amphibious lift capability, and Royal Marines. No, don't need it. Let's get rid of Invincible. Do we really need Art Royal, who was in build then? And he wanted to get rid of all mine countermeasures because he didn't think that the mine threat.
Yeah, the mine threat. No one's going to need the mine threat to look after that anymore.
Absolutely not. No, why would you need minesweepers? There was a paper written by the Maurice Johnston, a British Army general tasked with writing a paper about anti-submarine warfare. Fuck my life. Isn't that just the Ministry of Defence?
It does sound like it, doesn't it? Right,
and he was
someone wholly inappropriate. Yes, get someone wholly inappropriate to write a paper on something that they don't know anything about.
The excuse being, well, he had good advice from some advisors. Yeah, absolutely fucking fantastic. One of the conclusions that this cavalryman, this person who spent some of his career guarding places like Buckingham Palace on the back of a horse, one of his conclusions was surface ships really don't need anti-submarine weapons. So it's just, there you go. All right, that's standard.
Say they need horses for a moment.
Yeah, probably more horses. That's what you need. So 1982, come the Falklands, we're at the tail end of amphibious capability, it looks like. Royal Marines are going to be absolutely slashed, if not disbanded. Assault ships Phillips and Intrepid would go. We would lose Hermes. She would be decommissioned early. Invincible would be sold to Australia. Illustrious might be kept going. Art Royal will probably be cancelled on the stocks. Norway, forget about it. Any idea of any kind of amphibious operations anywhere apart from Europe, that was going to be dead. And an absolute end to the kind of low level of British Army Royal Navy Lodge landing training. Everything was going to go to BAOR or UK Air Defence, and exercises like Alloy Express, thing was still sort of taking place, thank God. There was still this exercise involving ATP-8, which I think it still is the kind of the Bible for amphibious operations. But prior to the Falklands, we were looking at that becoming a dead publication. It just wasn't going to go.
Okay, then. So the amphibious landings were given the codename Operation Sutton, and Commodore Mike Clapp was in charge of the amphibious group, which was designated.
Did you say Mike Clapp?
Mike Clapp. Mike Clapp. And the amphibious group was designated Task Group 317.0. If Sharkey Ward was Mr. Sea Harrier, Mike Clapp was Mr. Buccaneer, and have a little read in the annexes about it on his bio. So when the invasion occurred, the Argentine invasion occurred, Commodore Clapp had just returned from a visit to Denmark and Germany, where they'd been planning a big NATO amphibious exercise. He quickly set about trying to get some extra officers to augment his staff, and he spent most of that first weekend beginning preparations and learning all they could from people who had been down in the Falklands, particularly people like Ewan Southby Taylor. Amongst the preparations were getting the landing ships of the Round Table class, that's the likes of Tristram, Galahad, Geraint, fitted with 40mm Bofors guns from museums, and also trying to organise a mine countermeasures team. Commodore Clapp, Brigadier Julian Thompson from the Royal Marines, and Major General Jeremy Moore were responsible for setting up the amphibious force. As Dom touched on earlier, the first problem was that they didn't know what ships they would have, what force they would carry, and it was soon established that 3 Commando Brigade alone wasn't going to be sufficient to take on the number of Argentines in the Falklands. So there was a meeting with Cinque Fleet, Admiral Fieldhouse, on the 4th of April, and it was decided to add 3 and 5 para to the force. Also, a battery of Rapier anti-aircraft missiles would deploy, 2 troops of light tanks, Scimitars and Scorpions from the Blues and Royals, and getting additional troop lifting helicopters was a high priority.
Didn't 2 para go as well?
I've got 3 and 5 para. I'm not sure, maybe. So Fearless, HMS Fearless, was flagship of the amphibious force, and she sailed from Portsmouth on the 6th of April. Her captain was Jeremy Larkin, and he was a mariner by trade. He commanded 3 submarines previously, and as the ship's captain, he was also chief of staff to Commodore Clapp and Brigadier Thompson. Captain Larkin knew Admiral Woodward from the submarine force, and that would become important later. If the islands were going to be recaptured, an amphibious landing to put troops and all of their equipment and ammunition and stores was going to be required. So the success of the whole Falklands campaign, in my opinion, depended on the amphibious landings. Those amphibious landings were the Falklands War. If they didn't go right for the British, the Argentines would win. And since the war, there's been a lot of conjecture as to whether or not the loss of one or both of the carriers would have resulted in the failure of the whole campaign. Perhaps a better question would be that could the campaign have been successful if either Fearless or Intrepid, or for example, the Canberra had been lost? The carriers were indeed high-value units, but the LPDs and Canberra were the mission essential units. So Commodore Clapp said after the war, as the force was heading south, there was a lot of political pressure to make a show of force, and that implied that we might have to go straight in. And that caused a lot of concern, as Dom had mentioned, because the ships had loaded so quickly. They weren't sure what they had in which ship, in which order. So the staff actually looked into taking South Georgia first and then reorganising the ships at South Georgia before moving on to the Falklands. But it was decided to retake South Georgia with other assets. The 3 key factors, he said, in the planning were where to land and when to land, and the SBS was sent ashore to various locations to recce them for suitability. And he talks about, which we're going to talk about in a moment, the reasons for choosing San Carlos were primarily because it was landlocked and would allow boat work to be carried out by night and day. The hills around it would hamper air attack, and it offered immunity from Exocet attack. As a former Buccaneer navigator, Mike Clapp, and having been second in command of the destroyer Norfolk, which carried out the entry into service firings of Exocet, Commander Commodore Clapp was very aware of the air and missile threat, but he did acknowledge that San Carlos wasn't without its problems. The surrounding hills would make it difficult to spot approaching aircraft on radar, and it was also deep enough for the Argentines to operate their diesel submarines in it, and it might be mined. The final factor in the planning was that the timings were driven by the arrival of what was called the last piece of the jigsaw, which was HMS Intrepid, and as a result of the knot review, she had not long been decommissioned. Ship's company were recalled from where they'd just been posted. From her captain, Peter Dingerman's down, she sailed with about 95% of the ship's company she had before decommissioning, and she only left 2 weeks after Fearless, which was a remarkable achievement. And it also had to be considered, which I think we touched on before, when Ricky was thinking was saying we had to be done by the end of June, was how long past the landings the amphibious ships could support the troops ashore, which was thought to be about 3 weeks. The force spent 2 weeks at Ascension Island, where the ships were unloaded and reloaded in the correct order for the landings. The amphibious shipping, it's listed as Fearless and Intrepid. The Sir Percival, Sir Lancelot, Sir Bedivere, Sir Tristram, Sir Galahad, Sir Geraint, Canberra, which we talked about before, Europic Ferry, Norland, which was a North Sea ferry, Elk, which was a ro-ro ship, and Atlantic Conveyor. And the final consideration for the exact timings was that they wanted the approach to the islands for the assault to be made in poor weather, particularly visibility to conceal the approach to achieve an element of surprise.
Right, so 5 para, that may be a throwback to current how they are in brigades and the rest of it, but it was 1, 2, and 3 para in those days. So it was 2 para that went on. I was just checking because the person that I was talking about who died that I knew, who was on the Falklands, he was with 5-9 Commando Squadron, but had previously been 9 para Squadron Royal Engineers, but he was with 2 para, and 2 para was the only regiment that was on to the main battles.
Three para landed on Green Beach.
Yes, but there was no 5 para. That was my point.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Two para had Blue Beach. 3 para had Green Beach. So 3 para moved up to San Carlos, and 2 went up to Sussex Mountain on the landing. But
2 para were on they were on 2 different battles. Right. They're the only para regiment that was.
Yeah.
If I they were at Goose Green as well.
Yeah, so so Tim's pretty much covered most of it. The amphibious objective area, picking it. So I've alluded to ATP8, which is the NATO Bible for amphibious landings. As Tim says, it had to be difficult, if not impossible to attack by Exocet or torpedo, because there was a real concern that St. Louis, she might be kind of loafing around there. That was the worst case scenario. Diesel electric submarine in those congested waters, it would have been a real drama. But funnily enough, that's where the Type 12 frigates, Plymouth and Yarmouth, may well have excelled, because you can't go after a diesel electric submarine in a very shallow area, as Hop will confirm. Really difficult. But if you've got a platform that can start chucking depth charges around, cha-ching, right? That's going to be an absolute winner. It had to be low terrain to minimize the effect on radar, because, as we've seen, moving target indicators were not really a thing. but it had to be high enough to hazard jets trying to carry out low-level fighter-bomber attack. So, Hop, I don't know, does this make sense? 3 seconds minimum, doing a fast run-in using parachute-retarded bombs, that's about what you'd need?
Yeah, I mean, to get away from it, at speed is dependent, speed and altitude, but it seems like most of their attacks were 450 knots or faster. So if you think about it, the frag range on the smaller bombs, which would be the 500-pound Mark 82s or the equivalent that was Spanish made, that were around that same weight. You're going, if you're at 450 knots, here's how a pilot thinks about it. You go 450 knots, you're doing 8 miles, you're doing a mile in every 8 seconds. So the frag pattern's about a half mile, and you're going to need that amount of time. So you're going to need that 3-4 seconds from bomb release to be past the target out of the frag range, if it's a retarded bomb. If it's a non-retarded bomb, it's just going to fly formation with you, basically, and you need more time than that. So that those are sort of the snake eye and the parachute retarded bombs that the Argentinians had available to them. You do need that 3 seconds.
So really what you're saying is, because you're flying in at a certain speed, the bomb drops, but you need to be getting out of the way, and a plane flying at 500 knots is going a mile per 8 seconds. Yeah?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a real risk that the frag of the thing that you've dropped might come up and hit you.
Oh, it's a huge risk. Tons of aircraft have been lost that way. If you had a snake eye that didn't deploy its the fins to retard it slowing down, but it fused anyway and hit the ship by some miracle, you've got a pretty good chance of knocking yourself out of the fight. I mean, you're going to take tons of metal up through your underside. So
you might having to be eject yourself, right? Having dropped your own bomb.
If you survive long enough to do that, yeah.
Putting Canberra where she was at the anchorage, that required a really hard turn. That was probably deliberate.
Yes. If I really understand where Canberra was, you would have basically the attack profiles they're running. You wanted about a 1,500 yards straight in to get your alignment. You're going to do some jinking in that. I'll be talking a little bit about this later, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but need about a 1,500 yards straight in. That's essentially a mile. And if I'm right about where the Canberra is, you would not have that mile straight in that you need to sort of stabilize, put your pipper on the target and go.
Because you're still going to be in the turn.
And pulling, that's a nightmare scenario, because when you're pulling like that, your bomb is under G also. So all your calculations and everything else are off.
The other stuff I've got had to be as far east as possible to minimize loiter time for any strike packages. Had to be easy for the ships taken up from trade to get into. That's something that no one really covers. Right? These are merchant ship skippers. They sail out of Southampton or Felixstowe or Hull or wherever, and then they follow a nav track, and then they go alongside in a port after a few days. This was requiring merchant vessel masters to do a coordinated entry into an anchorage, no lighting, and I don't think they were allowed to transmit on navigation radar either. Nordland didn't have a Polaris, Tim. She wasn't fitted on the bridge for one. So the skipper had to basically follow my leader on the way in. It had to be sheltered from weather because, of course, you're using landing craft. Landing craft do not like rough weather. They are flat-bottomed. There comes a sea state where you can't do any kind of disembarkation. And if you're embarking troops from netting, and imagine you're an infantry, you're carrying 120 pounds worth of kit, and you're going down a scrambling net into a landing craft, there's going to be a weather point where you simply can't do that. So it had to be deep water. It had to be sheltered. It needed room for the escorts to maneuver because they're going to be under continuous air attack. So they need freedom to maneuver to some degree. Mexifloats, which were like big floating rafts that we use, motorized rafts. It had to be sheltered enough to use them because they would be the primary means of getting heavy equipment ashore. And as I say, all they are is a raft. So once the weather takes a turn for the worse, that's it. Can't get your
dead in the water at that point. And the thing to remember here for anyone who's listening is that when we talk about you've got your equipment, the soldiers at that point were wearing 58 pattern webbing, right? I.e. webbing that was designed in 1958. Some of them wouldn't have even had a Bergen. They'd have had the whole 58 pattern webbing caboodle and a large pack, which is a little bit akin to a large pack of the 1937 webbing of the Second World War. It was dreadful stuff. Nothing like what you see now, right? And you certainly would not be wanting to be climbing down netting wearing that rubbish.
Yeah, and you need more than one beach. So this was a big consideration during the planning stage for Commander Amphibious Forces. He needed 4 beaches because he needed to get everyone off the ships. Because once they were discovered, once the cat was out of the bag, he knew that the Argentine Air Force were going to come after him with a passion. So speed of disembarkation was absolutely essential. They needed the ability to secure the beachhead, get an all-round defense, take the high ground, because there was the possibility the Argentines would launch an immediate counterattack on the beachhead. Beach gradients, David.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was my job, right? As a diver, was one of my jobs was to, in actual fact, go, what is the landing zone like, right? And go, what's the beach gradient and the stuff you would have to do. You would go down, check out, see how firm the ground was on the bottom, check whether it's gravel, is it sand. Yeah.
You need to get your vehicles off, but what's the one thing down south you don't want the blokes to be before they've even got off the beach? Piss wet through.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you need to be able to get a landing craft off again. So they run into the beach, drop the ramp, troops out. They don't want to be jumping into the waist-high water because straight away you've got an admin nightmare there.
You have people with hypothermia coming down with hypothermia in weather like that. And the thing to remember here, these are the days of DMS and putties, right? They didn't, in actual fact, there were very few people who had the high leg boots.
Yeah, and then finally, the distance to Stanley had to be as short as possible. Very few choke points, if possible, because we didn't want to get bogged down into an attritional battle. They needed to be able to get to Stanley, liberate the capital, and be done and dusted by the winter came in. And then finally, the Royal Navy was it would be ideal if we had a landing strip, if not just for him launching cap, which for a Harrier vertical takeoff and landing, for fuel, not exactly ideal. Although they could land on Intrepid and Fearless and refuel, because I've seen a photograph of one doing that. But emergency recovery, things like that. So they also wanted a landing area where they could build a temporary airstrip. And that's what happened in the end with HMS Castle.
They had 11 field squadron who went over. As I believe, someone will no doubt message me and say, no, it wasn't 11 field, but we had our own airfield squadron who went along to get Elm and do that.
Yeah. So, you've got a mass of considerations. They were very lucky. Ewan Taylor, he was a bit of a Bible of knowledge about the islands. And whilst, the mine and the submarine threat was very real, after all of that, due consideration, San Carlos was picked simply because it was the most expedient. It had good gradients. Landing craft were going to be absolutely key. The LSLs, so Percival, Tristram, etc., they would be able to run up the beach and disembark as necessary. It was sort of the best radar conditions. It wasn't ideal. There were a couple of other choices. Of course, Rapier was supposed to be the ace on the sleeve of protecting an amphibious beachhead. As it turned out, it was a bit shit, to be fair. Salvador Water was another one. Cow Bay, that was renowned as having poor weather, and the going for the infantry over to Port Stanley was notoriously bad. Volunteer Bay, again, not particularly great weather. The conditions for getting landing ships and landing craft run up beaches was considered to be pretty poor. Berkeley Sound, heavy swell, so that was never going to be a goer. Egg Harbor, going back to Sandy Woodward, kind of maybe being divorced from reality, he suggested a place called Low Bay on Lafonia. There's one issue with that. It's got no fucking beach. Staff had to gently kind of point out that an amphibious landing with no beach.
With no beach, there's going to be a disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah. So you know there is there are the considerations.
I'll just jump in if I can on Major Ewan Southby Taylor, and I think he was a bit of a. I just did a quick bit of research on him today and looked in a couple of bits. He was a bit of a sort of ace up the sleeve, and he was in charge of the Royal Marines Landing Craft branch at the time. And as you mentioned, he'd spent a lot of time of his life down in the Falklands. And in '79, at the request of the Foreign Office of the Mod, he was tasked to rewrite the concept of ops for defence of the Falklands. Very quickly after the invasion, he met Brigadier Julian Thompson, and they were really, really good friends. And in fact, Ewan Southby Taylor said Julian Thompson was the only person he ever lent his yacht to. And Thompson said, "I need you to tell me everything you knew about the Falkland Islands." And he said, "I'm not going to unless you promise to take me with you." And he didn't want to hand over all the maps, charts, sketches, and photographs that he'd collected over the years, which proved invaluable. On the way south, he spent a lot of time going around the ships, briefing people. And he said, despite his best efforts, many of the staff officers would grasp that everything that was needed to sustain the troops ashore, including every mouthful of food, would have to go over the beach. And he said that the Argentines would be doing the same, but by air because of the total exclusion zone. And it was his opinion that we could stop them moving stuff in by air, but Admiral Woodward wouldn't take him seriously, which is another example of Woodward not listening to his experts.
Seems to be a theme at this point. So we've got the Argentinian order of battle.
The Argentinians had a pretty damn big Air Force and capable on paper. It's important to say at the beginning of this part of it that they had been training to deal with other South American enemies rather short-sightedly, obviously. But I'll go through their order of battle real quickly. So what we have is we'll talk about their bases real quickly. They have about 6 major air bases running from the north, Trelew, then Rivadavia, San Julian, south of that, Santa Cruz, Rio Gallegos, and closest to the Falklands, Rio Grande. San Julian and to the south, and all those fields to the south are where a lot of the attacks came from because they're significantly shorter. San Julian, for example, 425 nautical miles to the Falklands, to the basically the AOA. Rio Grande, even shorter, 380 nautical miles. This is important. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So just running down the scorecard, the Argentinians had 27 daggers, which essentially are a Mirage 5 that they had bought. It's a fairly capable attack aircraft, very fast. They had 16 A4Cs that were operated by the Air Force, 30 A4Bs in various states of repair, 15 Mirage 3s, which was sort of their primary air defense fighter, and was very active in the early days of the war, but less so up until 21 May, and then they got really active again. The Navy had 8 A4Qs that were Quebecs that were carrier qualified, but never really flew any attack missions off the deck. They had on strength 5 Super Entendards, but only 4 of them were operational. The 5th was being cannibalized. 2 S-2A trackers. Those are anti-submarine warfare, twin engine prop aircraft, but were important not for their ASW roles, but as pathfinders and sort of hounding and collecting intelligence for the British on British ships. 5 C-130s, 2 KC-130s, super important, probably the most important aircraft in the entire conflict were the KC-130s. Those are C-130s that are capable of air refueling. Outsized importance. Those 2 aircraft, in my mind, are the 2 most important aircraft that they owned. 24 Pucara, 6, which is a turboprop light attack ground attack aircraft, actually fairly capable and able to take a hell of a lot of bandable damage before you knock it out of the sky. 6 MB-39s, which is a training jet / light attack jet. All those, for operational purposes, were based at Port Stanley. And they actually had some participation in the battle. 4 T-34 Cs, which is a single-engine turboprop trainer that has a light attack version that they operated out of the Pebble Island area up north. 6 Canberras and a whole mess of helicopters. But anyway, for their fixed-wing assets were roughly 143 strong on paper. At these different bases, they'd have quite an array. For example, San Julian, which I mentioned earlier, they had 16 A4Cs of Group of 4 and 14 Daggers from Esquadron 11, Group 6. Rio Gallegos, 8 Mirage 3s and 30 A4Bs, and then if you go down to Rio Grande, they had a real mixed bag there. They had an entire squadron of Daggers, 13. All the A4s ended up there when they were pulled off the carrier. All the Entendards ended up there, and the Neptunes. So that would be largely a naval base as far as aircraft are concerned, but heavily augmented by the Daggers. A lot of ground attack launched out of there. On the Falklands, they had 24 Pucara, 6 of the MB-339 Zeromaki, 4 T-34s. And in addition, way up north, they had their Canberras, which are very capable sort of medium bomber, but they didn't, like many of their things, they didn't really use them properly. The British. Okay, so that is sort of a quick and dirty on what the Argentinians had, which is a lot. Let's compare that to the Brits real quickly. The Brits had, initially they deployed with 12 Sea Harriers on the Hermes and 9 Sea King anti-submarine / transport helicopters. They augmented those sort of early May with an additional 4 Shars, Sea Harriers, and 6 GR3s. So they ended up on the Hermes with a total of 20 plus. I guess they lost a couple, but they had 16 Shars and 6 GR3s. So they had 22. It's a larger carrier than the Invincible. And there was only 1 squadron of Sea Harriers operating from each. So Hermes was 800 Squadron. Invincible was 801 Squadron, the famous Sharkey Ward. He started out with 8 Shars, got 4 Shars from the Atlantic conveyor, and they also the Invincible, because I think it originally started life as a anti-submarine carrier. Had 11 HAS-5s from the 820 Naval Air Squadron. Sprinkled around the fleet were some Wessex anti-submarine helicopters, 3 of those, multiple Wessex transports, helicopters, and of course, Chinooks were on the Atlantic conveyor, but they didn't survive the Exocet strike. So as you can see or hear from the numbers I've given you, there's probably triple the number of combat aircraft attached to the Argentinian. So advantage Argentinians for this one. I didn't mention they also had some Learjets that they used. So they had a pretty extensive order of battle.
So you said Learjets. What?
Yeah.
They're using the Learjets?
They were using the Learjets because they had actually much better communications and navigation equipment on those. They were using them in a variety of things. And the irony of it is that a lot of the guys flying the Learjets had served in the RAF in World War II. Like one guy had been a Lank pilot. Another guy, I think, had flown for Coastal Command. Anyway, so these Learjets were pressed into service. They were called the Phoenix Squadron, and they were used for reconnaissance to try and sniff around the fleet. They would use them to simulate the attack profiles of daggers and antidards and test the reactions, and also a little bit as pathfinders, leading the way for some of these for the A4s and the Entenards and the daggers, because they didn't have very good onboard navigation equipment. The A4s never could seem to get their very low frequency Omegas to work very well. So they were doing good old fashioned map to ground, stopwatch, mag compass navigating, which we'll talk about later, but that ain't easy over the ocean, especially in a single engine fighter.
I think Exeter killed a Learjet, didn't she? Because she killed it from San Carlos Water with a Sea Dart, but they were on open comms, and the air crew were screaming over an open frequency as they went down. Yeah,
like that. A bone-chilling story, but that's what I can't find any other account of the Learjet going down. They only lost one only. So yeah, it was pretty chilling stuff.
I mean, how long? But those pilots must have been. They must have been in their 70s.
Oh, they were 22 years old, flying for the RAF or whatever. Fast forward, they're in their like 50s. A lot of these guys, they were retired airline pilots. These were older, experienced fellas, as it were. Had done a lot of different things, and then out of a sense of patriotism, stepped forward and flew Learjets into combat. So really the most important attack aircraft are, in no particular order, the A4. And there's three varieties of Skyhawks: A4Cs, A4Bs, and A4Qs, the navalized version. For all intents and purposes, they pretty much do the same attack profiles, although the ones flown by the naval pilots are initially far more effective because they've actually trained in anti-ship warfare. The other two most important aircraft types are the daggers, of which there are quite a few, and they're used as attack aircraft by the Argentinians. Very fast, very brave pilots coming down the sound at the speed of heat, 50 feet. However, they're not real good at bombing ships. They get better, but there's all sorts of issues with that type. And the third most important but least numerous of all these types are the Super Entendard, which is the most modern attack jet they have. It's the only one with any kind of electronic sensing countermeasures, radar. It carries the Exocet missiles. It punches above its weight numerically in the Falklands War, and those are the most important. Some people might say, "Oh, well, what about the Mirage 3?" It's not a big player because it's has very limited time on station, and it's really only used to try and engage or draw off the British cap, and the Brits basically don't bite, from what I can tell. Tim, I mean, do you see it any differently?
No, I read somewhere that they held quite a lot of the Mirages back post the Black Buck raids because they were concerned with if they can bomb Stanley, they can bomb Buenos Aires.
I do think that was a concern, but on the 21st, they ran 4 different flights. Usually it was a flight of 2, so 8 sorties. But if you look at the number of Mirage 3s they have, they're definitely not throwing them all into the fight.
No.
Join us next week for part 3 and part 4.